Okay, so as I mentioned, the next several lessons are basically on comma usage. So it's sort of, leading into this, we talked about dependent clauses and independent clauses and some of those sentence structures. And I mentioned this before with the comma. The best definition of a comma is that it's punctuation that separates your sentence into meaningful units. Some people will say, well, it represents a pause. Yeah, I mean, that's typically where you do pause is when you get to those, sort of meaningful units, but that's not really the purpose of a comma. When I was younger and I started, taking some college classes initially, and I didn't know really how to use a comma. I just it was like intuitive, and most of the time I got it right, but there were certainly some here and there that were not where they should have been, and there was other times I should have had a comma where I didn't. So we'll get that all worked out here, and it's a really good lesson to, again, get us ready for writing, to strengthen our sentence structure. So it's a good unit here, not just to understand where commas go, but it'll help us understanding those, parts of a sentence and how sentence structure can vary. So the first lesson here that we're going to be doing is commas with beginning, ending, and inessential phrases. So we use a comma to separate an introductory element. Lastly, I will discuss, independent variables. Lastly, comma. Last Tuesday, we had a heat wave in Columbus. Last Tuesday, comma. Those are types of introductory elements. They can be a single word. They may be an entire phrase. Use a comma to set off the words yes and no, to set off a tag question from the rest of the sentence, and to indicate direct address. So, particularly if you're directing your sentence at an individual, Billy, comma, will be, or are you going to the movies? Something like that. It's particularly when you're asking a question directed at somebody. And to indicate, direct address, punctuation is set off non-restrictive parenthetical elements or to indicate a pause, right? That's the last idea there, indicating a pause. Every other scenario here is really separating your sentence into meaningful units. And also avoiding them. So just like, we use commas when we're writing numbers, right? We use them to separate our numbers into meaningful units, starting at the 1,000 place, right? 10,000, 100,000, a million, billion, trillion, right? We use the comma there to help readers see those meaningful units. So it's the same idea with our sentence structure in language arts. So let's go ahead and begin.
Hi, this is the lesson about commas with beginning, ending, and inessential phrases. Commas can be used to separate out an extra part of a sentence that's not essential to the main clause, whether it's in the beginning, middle, or end of a sentence.
Yeah, so again, the comma is really the workhorse of a sentence. It's going to be the most common punctuation that you see within a sentence, for sure. So, and it's used in several different ways.
Commas are probably the most misused punctuation. Well, to be fair, commas are also the most common type of punctuation. They're used for a lot of things, and generally, people think of a comma as a pause when they read. The problem is that sometimes people put commas wherever they want, without thinking. When you're writing, the thought process in your head is sometimes stop and go. It doesn't necessarily logically show someone else how the parts of your sentence fit together so they can understand it better. That's what punctuation is supposed to do. There was one student I had who went to a family reunion. She was trying to find the contact information for someone she met there. She didn't know the woman's name or relationship to her, and she texted her cousin. She wrote this sentence: "I'd like to get in touch with this woman who was in charge of pies yesterday." So her cousin texts back, "Which woman was it?" Well, they eventually figured it out, but when I looked at my student's sentence, I thought I saw what was going on. I'm guessing her cousin isn't a very careful reader, but picks up on some punctuation clues like most of us do. So the cousin paid attention to the main part of the sentence and sort of ignored the part after the comma, because commas usually set off non-essential phrases, ones that you don't need to understand the whole idea of the sentence. A phrase that describes the woman, like "who was in charge of pies yesterday," shouldn't have a comma. The comma tells the reader that it's just extra information, not information that defines what you're talking about. Here, let me show you more about commas.
Right. So in this idea here, setting off inessential phrases. So we talked about this some, like an interrupting phrase. Does it change the does the idea in the sentence change with or without that information? So here it would change, right? I'd like to get in touch with this woman. You don't even have a complete idea. Well, you do technically, but who was in charge of pies yesterday? So that is not an inessential phrase. It is essential to the idea of the sentence. So you're not going to have a comma there separating that out. It would just be, "I'd like to get in touch with this woman who was in charge of pies yesterday."
Now, one place that you use a comma is with a separate word, phrase, or clause at the beginning of a sentence. The comma helps the reader separate out extra words or phrases that introduce the sentence. Transitional words like "however" or "of course" often introduce a sentence and are followed by a comma. Of course, there is a solution. However, there are 3 exceptions. Words like yes, no, or okay are followed by a comma when they introduce a sentence. "Yes, we have some asparagus." "No, I'm not coming to the party." Names follow the same rule. If they introduce a sentence, they're followed by a comma. "John, can you get me a water?" But if the name is not separate, if it's the subject of the sentence, for example, there's no comma. "John brought me some water." Adding a comma.
Right. So it's a matter of understanding what's the subject, and are you directing or addressing somebody? So John brought me some water. John is the subject, right? So not going to set that off. In that first example, you are asking John to bring you water. So you're directing that question or action. It could also be an imperative statement towards an individual. So John, can you get me a water? So you're going to set that off with the comma.
Introduction doesn't just apply to words or short phrases. If you begin a sentence with a subordinate clause or prepositional phrase, put a comma after that, too. Remember, the comma shows the reader where the independent clause begins. When you go to the store, don't forget to buy milk. In the future, all cars will be self-driving.
So yeah, we've talked about this already some, right? What is a subordinate clause? Subordinate conjunctions that don't stand on their own, like the fanboy words for, and, nor, but, or, yet. I had to think about it. Or so, fanboys. But here, those introductory, a subordinate clause or prepositional phrase. So prepositional phrase, right, has a preposition in there, which basically locates something, right? Whether it's in time or relevant or in relationship to other things. So in the future, right? That's a relationship with time, when something's going to happen relative to today. In the future, comma, all cars will be self-driving. The subordinate clause at the top there, when you go to the store, don't forget to buy milk. Subordinate, right? Because you do not have a complete sentence, that does not stand alone. When you go to the store, need more information there. Don't forget to buy milk. Complete sentence, right? Do not forget to buy milk.
It's common to forget the comma after a longer introductory phrase or clause, and usually it's not too important. But in your formal writing, it's a good idea to put in this comma to help the reader understand where the independent clause begins. You want your writing to be as clear as possible.
And that's one area where it might get a little tricky, is understanding exactly where your introductory phrase or your subordinate clause ends, particularly with introductory phrases, right? You don't want to make sure that you're cutting it too quickly by putting a comma. Make sure that you get the entire introductory phrase.
Take a look at this sentence. Is there an introductory word, phrase, or clause? Where would you add a comma?
Right, so we got an introductory phrase here for sure. After the trade show is over, can we go out to dinner? So we look at that and we think, okay, where do we need a comma? Where do we have a complete idea, for one? So if I was to ask, can we go out to dinner? That is an entire sentence, right? That is an entire idea, asking if we can go out to dinner. So what comes before that is an introductory clause or phrase, should say introductory phrase. After the trade show is over, comma, can we go out to dinner? Or a prepositional phrase, right? Because after, it's a preposition. After the trade show is over, comma, can we go out to dinner? So it's going to be after the word over. And the way these questions are, the choices are worded and everything, you just got to be careful, right? So you have to kind of visualize it. If I'm going to put that comma after over, right? I'm thinking about after the show is over, comma, can we go out to dinner? So after the word over.
Great job. This sentence starts with a subordinate clause. Read each clause separately. When the trade show's over, can we go out to dinner? Of course, the first clause can't stand on its own, but it does sound like a whole part of the sentence. Adding a comma between them helps the reader separate out the two parts and understand the sentence. Now let's talk about inessential phrases, sometimes called non-essential phrases. When you add extra information in a sentence, you can set it off with commas to separate it out from the rest of the sentence. The commas let the reader know the information is inessential. It's not really needed to understand the whole sentence. The problem is often figuring out what is inessential information and what isn't. One easy test is to take the word or phrase out of the sentence. Does it still make sense? Take a look at this example. My last day, which is a Thursday, looks like it will be busy. If you took out, which is a Thursday, the sentence would still make sense. Here's another example. The pilot, who was working that day, got stuck in traffic. Now, this sentence depends a little bit on context. Are you talking about one pilot? And she just happens to be working that day? That's what this sentence means with the commas. But if you take away the commas, the sentence is distinguishing which pilot you mean. Without the commas, the reader knows that you're using who was working that day to describe which pilot got stuck in traffic. Clauses starting with that are always essential and should never have commas. Like this. She wished that she could go to the conference. The book that is required for this class is expensive. Another test is whether you can move the word or phrase to different parts of the sentence. Does it still make sense? Then that's an inessential word or phrase that should have commas around it. Remember the words however and of course? They can move around a sentence, and they get set off by commas. Here's an example. However, Janice was late 3 times last week. Janice, however, was late 3 times last week. Janice was late 3 times last week, however. Other transitional words and phrases like therefore, on the other hand, in other words, nonetheless, or furthermore, work in a similar way. So look out for transitional words in the middle or at the end of a sentence. They should be.
And just a reminder here, that's if they're at the end or beginning. So therefore, comma, such and such. On the other hand, comma. If you're using those transitional words, to replace our fanboy conjunctions like but, you use a semicolon and a comma. So if it's separating two independent clauses, you're going to use a semicolon before it. If it's used in an introductory fashion at the beginning of a sentence, you just use the comma.
You'll also want to use commas if a word or phrase interrupts the flow of the sentence. Is the sentence hard to read without commas? This idea often applies to descriptions that follow a noun. Here's an example. Joshua, an expert marksman, is teaching the archery class. The phrase an expert marksman describes Joshua. Without the commas, this sentence is difficult to read. The commas let the reader know how the words, an expert marksman, fit into the sentence. Look out for inessential words and phrases in your writing. Commas help the reader understand their meaning.
Yeah, so, can you remove it? And does the sentence still make sense? That's the rule of thumb with the inessential phrase and interrupting phrase. If you can remove that, you still have a sentence, then you're going to set off that phrase with commas.
Where would you add commas to this sentence?
Right. So our example here, last week, as a matter of fact, I ran into Damon at the store. So that's a little cluttered. It looks like we might need to set something off in commas. So here it's going to be after, week, and back. So as a matter of fact, that phrase we are setting off in commas, right? Because last week I ran into Damon at the store. Complete idea. Actually, last week, comma, I ran into Damon at the store would also work. You would need a comma after last week because I ran into Damon at the store. That's actually your independent clause, right? That is your complete sentence that stands alone. So last week, comma. As a matter of fact, comma, I ran into Damon at the store. And by doing that, we make a more complete, or a more complex.
The phrase, as a matter of fact, is a transitional phrase that could go at the beginning, middle, or end of a sentence. It should have commas before and after it when it's in the middle of the sentence.
Yeah, it would always have a comma. It just depends on where it was. If you start a sentence with it, as a matter of fact, comma, you would put it there. In this case, it comes, still towards the beginning of the sentence, but you're going to offset those phrases with commas.
Extra words or phrases at the end of a sentence are also set off by a comma. That includes inessential phrases that fall at the end of the sentence. The best solution is not always the most obvious one, of course. We went to the movie, which started at 5 o'clock. You also might add a name or a question at the end of the sentence. It's easy to learn, isn't it? You're on time today, Martina. So, if you recognize introductory phrases and inessential phrases, you'll recognize most ending phrases. They're just extra phrases or words that go at the end of a sentence. One type of ending phrase that's a little different is a phrase that contrasts or explains what came before it, like this. He was uneducated, not stupid. Now, there's one difference between commas after introductory phrases and commas before ending phrases. When a subordinate clause comes at the beginning of a sentence, it needs a comma to show when the independent clause begins. But when it comes at the end of a sentence, it doesn't need a comma. That's because the subordinating conjunction, like when, after, because, or until, already shows the beginning of the subordinate clause. You don't need a comma. So this sentence is not correct. The class will begin when the instructor arrives. It shouldn't have a comma.
We got into that a little bit as well. So subordinating conjunctions at the beginning of a sentence, comma, it's followed by a comma. If you end the sentence with the subordinating conjunction, it does not. Again, the subordinating conjunction list that we have, those words, they're up on Google Classroom. Knowing those will help, right? Understanding what a subordinating conjunction is. You've already had the independent clause introduced, so you don't need that additional comma there. Do we got more audio? That's weird. Okay. So yeah, it can get a little tricky. That's for sure.
Where would you add commas to this sentence?
Okay. So looking here, where will you add a comma? So we will start analyzing data after the tests are complete, Dr. Romero. So one of our clues here is that we have a name, right? We have a specific name. So it looks like we're going to set that off. We're addressing this Dr. Romero. We will start analyzing data after the tests are complete, comma, Dr. Romero. He's not essential, right? It's another way to think of it, to the sentence. We could just say we will start analyzing data after the tests are complete. Complete sentence, right? That's a complete independent idea. Dr. Romero set off there. We're addressing him. He's not the subject, right? It would be Dr. Romero will start analyzing data after the tests are complete, if he was the one analyzing data. So in this form, and again, thinking of our test taking skills and everything, they're not asking us to rearrange it. They're not asking us, what the subject is, anything else. They want to know if we need a comma and where it should be. So in that case, we are going to put it after the word complete.
Great job. This sentence ends in a name, Dr. Romero, which is not part of the main sentence. There should be a comma before the name at the end.
Right. That was not essential information. Let's go ahead, and we're up to our practice questions.
Now it's time to show that you've learned this concept. Try some practice problems to demonstrate your understanding.
Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen. Let me go ahead and get that. And let's just take about 10 minutes for this, because it's just sentences to look at. You don't have any whole passages or graphic data or anything to read. So take about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and take a look here and do some review. So go ahead and answer your questions there, and I will hit pause. The thing to remember, that sort of the first rule of thumb, looking for what is essential or not essential to the sentence. Well, where is my independent clause? That's our sort of the first rule. Find that, and the rest it'll help everything fall into place. So our first sentence here to look at: spicy soup was hot, but not too hot to eat. There's something else we want to look for, right? Conjunctions are fanboys words. So in this case, the spicy soup was hot, comma, but not too hot to eat. So if we see this one, it's a separating two independent clauses, right? Our most simple rule: the spicy soup was hot. That is one complete idea. Not too hot to eat, but not too hot to eat, right? That makes another complete idea. Conjunctions, foresee that, right? Just like any, that should signal us that we need some punctuation somewhere close to that conjunction, close to that fanboys word. So it's going to be after hot, right? So the spicy soup was hot, comma, but not too hot to eat. Yeah. So anytime, that's one rule of thumb too. If you're, look for your independent clauses to help you know where the commas go. Look for conjunctions. Look for transition words. Right here, Javier had a flat tire, which explained why he was late. So looking for that independent clause, Javier had a flat tire, right? That's a complete sentence right there. So are we going to need punctuation here? So yes, with which is a subordinate conjunction. So here, I'm sorry, not which is a what do you call it?
Tire.
Well, it's a pronoun. It's a determiner pronoun is what they're called. So yeah, it's I'm sorry, after, yeah, I almost selected the wrong one. After tire. See, these types of questions, I even got to think about, even though I know, right, it goes after tire, I'm looking at the word which, because that's where it should be, it should be before which, after tire. But I see those words sometimes, I get a little mixed up. Yeah, so Javier had a flat tire, comma, which explained why he was late. Yeah, an inessential phrase, right? That's what we're talking about. It provides more information, but is not essential to the main idea, right? The main idea, the complete idea is Javier had a flat tire, right? The extra information there, right? It's just icing on the cake. It's adding more to that idea. That's what we're going to separate with the comma. All right, the man at the door asked to see my driver's license. So if you look at that, you realize that's a whole idea, right? The man at the door, that's our subject. So there's no comma. We don't need a comma here. So if you actually look at the choices they give, right? So after man, the man, comma, at the door asked to see my driver's license. Well, if I'm putting a comma there, that would indicate the rest of this is a complete sentence. But if we say at the door asked to see my driver's license, we don't have a complete sentence, right? We're lacking the man as the subject. The man at the door explains where he was, right? But we don't need a comma at any location there. So let's say if we put it after asked, the man at the door asked, comma, to see my driver's license. Now we don't have an independent clause anywhere in that sentence. The man at the door asked, not a complete sentence. Well, I suppose it is a complete sentence. The man at the door. No, it still won't be complete. And then in that context, and then to see my driver's license, also not a complete sentence. And then if we put it after door, the man at the door, comma, asked to see my driver's license. Still, no, the complete idea here does not require any comma. The man at the door is the entire subject, right? The man basically is the subject. The man at the door is where he is at. That's explaining the subject to some degree. And then asked to see my driver's license. Asked is the verb here for that sentence. To see my driver's license is completing the idea. The rest of the predicate there. But no comma is needed. There's no inessential, is it? Yeah, inessential information that needs to be set off in commas. Yeah, the name man at the door is the subject, an essential part of the main clause. All of the other information is also essential to the main idea.
You're doing very well.
Keep
You
going.
got all of
Okay, so where do we need commas? Here, the child who had just turned 4 could read the sign. So, looking here at maybe, some of those sort of, what would be maybe a signal to, to sort of let us know, maybe pronouns, for example, sometimes we'll do that. So here, who, right? That might signal where we need to interrupt the idea. So who had just turned 4, not essential to the idea of the sentence, right? I could just simply say the child could read the sign, right? I still have a complete idea. Doesn't necessarily change, but here, yeah, we need, it's going to be a, so it's after child, the child, comma, who had just turned 4, comma, could read the sign. So we have a complete sentence, the child could read the sign, right? And we do not have a complete sentence, and we just said who had just turned 4. So that is our non-essential phrase, or inessential phrase there. And for this one, let's see, last Thursday, I saw Joan at the farmer's market. So again, identifying our independent clause, where do we have a complete idea? I saw Joan at the farmer's market, right? Complete idea, I is our subject, saw is our verb. Joan, right, is who I saw at the farmer's market, completes that idea. It's essential to where we saw her. Last Thursday, not essential. Again, thinking about a lot of times, these non-essential phrases will reference a point in time, right? In the future, yesterday, last Thursday, next week, right? We set those off because they're not essential to the main idea. So here, after Thursday, we're going to have our comma. Right? Doesn't stand on its own. It's not a complete sentence, for one. And it's basically, adding a comma between the clauses helps the reader separate them from essential information and non-essential information. Enrique is absent today, not just away from his desk. So Enrique is absent today. Complete idea there, right? So our comma is going to come after today. You don't see this type of sentence structure. It's more in creative writing than it would be in like formal writing. But I mean, that is correct. So Enrique is absent today, comma, not just away from his desk, right? Looking for that complete idea first. Okay, next one. Where would you add a comma here? So unfortunately, there were no parking spaces left. So there were no parking spaces left, right? That's our complete idea. Unfortunately, it's not an essential word, right? It explains the situation. It was unfortunate that I couldn't find a parking space, but not essential to the idea. The essential idea is there were no parking spaces. So after unfortunately, comma. Yep. And submit. All right, the comma helps the reader separate out the extra word that is used to introduce the sentence. It's used to introduce the idea, not essential to the idea. Our last one here. The woman who had taken a wrong turn is running late. So looking for that non-essential information. Again, right, we have a pronoun who we could look for. So who had taken a wrong turn, sounding like It's not essential. The woman is running late, right? That is our main idea. The woman is running late. Who had taken a wrong turn? That's our non-essential information. We put some commas around that. So after a woman and after turn. So the woman, comma, who had taken a wrong turn, comma, is running late. It's just basically adding that information, right? It's additional information, adding to the sentence, not essential to the main idea of the sentence. Yeah, again, what can I take out? Is there things I can remove and the sentence still makes sense?
So,
Then I
do you
like
have a
what
better understanding of commas now?
Leonard has to
We
say.
use commas all the time, but it's one of those things that most people don't really think about. When you understand why people use commas, it will be easier to understand when to use commas in your writing. Just remember that commas are used to separate things. And one use of commas is to separate out extra words and phrases so that you can identify the main part of the sentence. So, put commas around extra words or phrases at the beginning, middle, or end of a sentence, and put a comma to show the end of a subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence. It will help clarify your writing. Click Results to see how you did on the questions.
So, the easiest way to think about it, if I'm writing and I finish a sentence, I'm like, I might need a comma in there. Where is my main idea? Is there other information attached to that? If so, that's where I might need a comma. So, introductory phrases, prepositional phrases at the beginning of a sentence, transitional words, those words that are not essential to the main idea. They help the flow of our writing, right? Just like we kept talking about, starting last week, but simple sentences are great. They serve a purpose. But to connect our writing and make it flow better and add to the understanding for our readers, right? We start using these non-essential phrases. It helps, connect from one idea to the next. It helps add information that's going to be useful, not essential, but useful. So we need to make sure that also understand where we need to separate those ideas, and meaningful units. The best way to define what a comma does. The rest of the week, basically, we'll be discussing comma usage. And by the end, we'll be talking about, where we don't put them. But we're getting there, right? So the first rule, understanding where our complete idea is. That's what we've been working on for the last few weeks. Now flushing those out, expanding on those ideas. So any questions on, as far as using a comma for beginning, ending, and inessential phrases goes? Any questions on that? Okay, so just consider, breaking down a sentence. That's what we're doing. It's what we're going to continue to do as far as language, the grammar mechanics side of language arts goes. So we'll revisit commas on Thursday. Tomorrow we'll work more on reading comprehension. So we'll go to RLA reading for that lesson. And of course, we will have social studies, as always, at 12:15. So with all that said, if there's no questions, we'll meet up again tomorrow afternoon. All right. All right. You all have a good afternoon. Stay cool. It's going to be hot again. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.